All right, wonderful. Thanks. Welcome everybody to another Bother the Father. This is our Passion Tide Bother the Father, the one before Holy Week. We'll have one more next week, of course, and another one after. We'll have Friends Student Faith then for the first week of April. I'll try to determine the topic and I'll communicate that as time goes by. But this is Bother the Father. It's open forum. Any questions, any thoughts, any things you want to discuss? This is the time, the place to do it.
I've got a topic, unless
Go ahead.
Well, you mentioned it's Passion Tide, and that ties in with my question. Is a little bit of an explanation about the various seasons of the church and the various days of the church. I know there's Advent and Lent, Passion Tide, and Easter season,
right,
and so forth. But there's also in the days you got days of obligation. You've got feast days, solemnities. Memorials. Some things are optional, some things are not, and I know there's a hierarchy.
Yes.
Exactly how that breaks down and how it's determined
right.
for everything. Just like today you had mentioned, it's St. Joseph, and
right.
you get a break from Lent,
right?
Because it's a solemnity.
Solemnity. That's correct. Yeah, yeah. So the question is these different seasons and days of the church. How is the hierarchy determined? How do we know those things? And what are the situations really that come about? Is that kind of the Okay, good. All right. Well, yeah, of course we have the different liturgical seasons. Advent, Christmas. Advent starts the liturgical year with Advent. That is a time of preparation, really. So a lot of people think it's like a time of penance, and penance usually is involved with it. But the main purpose of Advent is for preparation for the coming of Jesus, right? Not only for Christmas time, but also the second coming of Jesus, right? So we're preparing our hearts and minds in this beginning of the liturgical year for the coming of Jesus, not only in the liturgy, but also into our homes, into our hearts, into our minds, to kind of level set and get ready for the coming year, right? But primarily for when Jesus is going to come again, because he told us he's going to do that. Then we have the Christmas season, not just the Christmas day, right? People think Christmas is just a day. That's not true. And it's good maybe look at also not just what we do currently, but also what's been done in the past, what they call the old calendar, right? So it's also interesting that when we talk about the liturgies, we have the calendar that came from Vatican II, but also we have the pre-Vatican calendar, which is celebrating the extraordinary form of the Mass. And for most big things, those calendars align, but sometimes they don't. Like, for instance, Christ the King, the Feast of Christ the King. Well, in the old calendar, that's actually celebrated at the end of October, not the end of November, right? Where in the new calendar, we celebrate at the end of the liturgical year. The old calendar does that too, but they look at the end of the liturgical year as the end of October and the coming of basically what they call All Hallows Tide, right? So Halloween, All Saints Day, All Souls Day, right? In the new calendar, we then have Christmas, and that also coincides with the old calendar. So, but in a little different way. So Christmas is always December 25th, whether you're in the extraordinary form or the Novus Ordo. There's always the octave of Christmas, meaning we celebrate 8 days if it were Christmas Day. And there's other feasts involved with that, like the Feast of St. John and Holy Innocents, and the Holy Family, typically if the Sunday falls within that time. And then it ends, of course, with the Solemnity of Mary, which is always January 1st. The octave, that's the octave, 8 days, right? 8 days after December 25th is always going to be January 1st, right? So we have that whole lineup. What's interesting is what happens after January 1st. So in the new calendar, we recognize that Epiphany is the Sunday that follows the octave, typically. Unless there's some kind of crazy thing where Christmas falls on a day of the week where you just have an extended time. But for the most part, you're always going to have Epiphany is going to follow the octave on that following Sunday.
At one time, was it always on the 6th?
In the old calendar, Epiphany is on January 6th because that's 12 days after Christmas, right? So the 12 days of Christmas, right? That song. That comes from the old liturgical calendar, right? And there's theological significance on all those things that are given to the lover on those days. It was actually a way to kind of spread the faith in places where the faith was being persecuted, right?
Like a clover.
Right. Yeah, but like the partridge and pear tree, well, that's obviously the unity of the Trinity, right? That's God, right? The two turtle doves, well, those are the two natures of Jesus Christ, right? Three French hens, well, the Trinity. So these are all meaning something in a theological sense, right? Because traditionally, Epiphany was always January 6th. You had 12 days of Christmas. That was it, right?
That's a good topic for you to consider for next year when we get into Advent.
What do you mean?
To break down all the liturgical significance.
Oh, sure.
Of the days.
That could be Friends from Faith, maybe. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so now then in the new calendar after Epiphany, you may have a Sunday after Epiphany, but then after that you would have always the baptism of Jesus, right? And the only time that would be different, odd, is if Epiphany fell on a Sunday where it was like a truncated time. So like for instance, this past Christmas season, it was a little truncated because Christmas fell on a Monday, right? So basically, the baptism of Jesus was the Monday after the Epiphany Sunday, right? But in the old calendar, Christmas goes all the way to Candlemas, right? The Feast of the Presentation. So that in the old calendar, what you'll see is not like the second Sunday of Ordinary Time. It would be the first Sunday after Epiphany, or the second Sunday after Epiphany, and then you would get into after Candlemas, what they call Quadragesima, right, which is kind of leading up to Advent, and so leading up to Lent, right, and so we have this ordinary time that happens after the baptism of Jesus, right. And then we're green, and we do that for about a few weeks, maybe a couple months, and then we get into Lent, starting with Ash Wednesday. Now, Lent and Ash Wednesday and Easter time are always going to be the same on the old calendar or the new calendar, right? They're always going to coincide.
But that's based on a moon cycle.
That's based on the lunar cycle, right? So because Passover is based on the lunar cycle, Easter is also based on the lunar cycle. Now, how we calculate those things between what we say the Eastern Church and the Western Church is a little different. They're both fine. They're both valid. The Eastern Church would say it's the first full moon after the vernal equinox. Or the Sunday after the vernal equinox. Okay?
Which is tonight. Mm-hmm. Tonight's the vernal equinox.
Will be the Sunday after that.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah. So, right. In the Western Church, we're a little more technical, right? So we would say it would be after the first full moon, the Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox, right? Because again, we're looking at this lunar cycle, right? And so the lunar cycle is a little different, and so we want to take that into account because that's how Passover has been calculated. They're both fine. They're both valid. They're both good. But the extraordinary form and the ordinary form would still follow that same calendar. So if you were to go to like St. Francis de Sales on Easter Sunday, they would celebrate Easter Sunday, right? Good. Now what happens though, what gets kind of weird though, is after Pentecost. Because Pentecost, we go back into ordinary time, yes? Well, in the extraordinary form, they have the Sundays after Pentecost. And then it kind of is like, the seventh week of ordinary time or the eighth week would be the first Sunday after Pentecost. And they would follow that calendar all the way through to the end of the year. Right? Now, within those times would be Christ, maybe the body and blood of Jesus, right? Corpus Christi. That falls on a Thursday, though, right? And even things like the Ascension. So the Ascension is not moved as it is in the Novus Ordo. Because that's a biblical timing, right? The Ascension was 40 days after the resurrection. Well, if you take 40 days after a Sunday, that's always going to be a Thursday, right? And even the Novus Ordo, it's up to the bishop to determine if they want to move that back to the following Sunday or keep it on Thursday. And it gets kind of complicated because there's places here in the United States still, such as in Nebraska, as well as in a lot of places in the Northeast, that still maintain Ascension Thursday on Thursday. And it is Holy Day of Obligation, all that good stuff. But a lot of the other places, like here in Missouri and other places, they have transferred Ascension Thursday to the following Sunday.
That's up to the bishop.
It's up to the bishop. It's a headache. right? And I mean, but I mean, there's a pastoral reason why the bishop does that. Partially that's because, well, do we want to overburden our faithful by another holy day of obligation? Okay. I think it was also like said, well, yeah, I mean, if people are going to come on Sunday and come on Thursday, we might as well have them come on Sunday, not actually lead them in the near occasion of sin. Well, people may come on Sunday or may come on Thursday regardless. So I don't know. I think if people were actually found their faith, they probably would go on Thursday anyway. But that was actually kind of a new development. That didn't really come around until like the early 2000s. Right. Like when I was growing up, Ascension Thursday, it was a holy day obligation. Right, you go, whatever. But that kind of changed, right? But for the old form, no, it does not change. It stays. Then we have ordinary time, and so the other thing that may change between the old calendar and new calendar would be like the different feast days, right? So certain saints' times would be different in the old calendar than they would be in the new. Actually, we see that also too. Like even a good example of that would be Valentine's Day. So Valentine's Day was suppressed in the new calendar in 1969. So if the Novus Ordo has not celebrated St. Valentine, unless maybe that's your titular church, right? If we were St. Valentine Catholic Church, well, then that would be a solemnity for us regardless, right? But if outside of that, we would actually celebrate these two saints called Cyril and Methodius on February 14th. These were apostles to the Slavic people. But if you go to like St. Francis of Sales or the Oratory, well, they're celebrating St. Valentine, right? So those are kind of maybe some difference you might see when it comes to different saints' days, right? Now, the second part of that question goes with like the different hierarchies of the feasts of the days, right? So in the extraordinary form, it's very simple. It doesn't matter whether it's a solemnity feast day. It's going to be celebrated regardless as either a low mass, a high mass, or what they call a missa cantata, right? So a low mass can be celebrated even on a Sunday, right? It's very simple. It would look kind of like maybe one of our daily masses for the most part, right? Not a lot of pomp and circumstance, but you still have like the Gloria. You'll still have like, these things are done for a particular solemnity or Sunday. You might not have two readings. You might have one reading in the gospel. You may or may not have a homily. So in the extraordinary form, a homily is never required, even on like these high feast days, right? Sometimes it's given, but it's not required. You would still have the liturgy of the Eucharist, right? All the good stuff that would happen, and in the end you would have the proclamation of the prologue of John, right? But that's kind of up to the celebrant or the person that kind of runs that particular church, right? So the step up from that would be what they call a high mass, and the high mass may include like incense and maybe a second reading, and maybe recitation of the recitation of the creed always happens, even in a low mass, even for a daily mass in the extraordinary form. And then the highest form of that would be like a missa cantata. So that's a completely sung mass, right? And so what that kind of looks like is typically you would have a choir or you have some other accompaniment that would play throughout the entire mass. So like, you've heard of like maybe like Beethoven and Bach that were composing these masses. That's what they were. That they was being played while the mass was being done by the priests and ministers in the sanctuary. This music is being played throughout the entire mass, right?
Be awesome.
Yeah, I mean that's what a missa cantata is.
Now,
right?
would that typically be the choir singing it, or would the priest be singing it, or
both and? So the choir would probably be. So anytime the priest would be addressing the congregation, or if you were doing like maybe what they call the collects or like this secrets, he'd be chanting those, and the choir may or may not take a break to hear the priest do that. They would just sing, right, while that was going on.
Background.
Yeah, yeah. Which is why also too there was such a reform that was called for, because most people were going to mass not necessarily to actually witness what was happening in the sanctuary, but to hear the music or pray the rosary or not necessarily participate in what was happening, right? So the Novus Ordo was an attempt to actually engage the faithful in a deeper way, so they can actually participate fully in the mass and not just like be there, right? But you wouldn't have like these hierarchies of that respect in the extraordinary form. It would just be low mass, high mass, missa cantata, and that may happen all on the same day. And it could be a ferial day for all you know, right? There's no actual saint being celebrated, just regular day. Let's just have missa cantata. Now, some of that we reserve for like maybe a high, like a Christmas or a Easter, or like maybe if it's your the feast day of your particular saint at the name of your church or something, right?
How about like today for Saint Joseph?
Maybe a high. I mean, you'll definitely have a low mass. Maybe you'll have a high mass. Again, it just depends on the celebrant that what they're doing, right, and how much planning they put ahead of time. Now, in the Novus Ordo, there's more of a distinction between these different hierarchies, right? So the lowest kind would be what we call a ferial day, right? So a ferial day is just like, hey, it's a normal day. There's no real saint on the calendar. It's just we're here, right? We're coming to mass on this day, right?
Are there any days that there's not really a saint?
Okay, so
saints, you would think
all right,
they're filled up.
So when it comes to these saint days, some saints have been suppressed, right? Meaning they're no longer on they're saints. We would recognize them and venerate them as saints, but they don't have a day anymore on the calendar, right? So a lot of these, and so to be fair, a lot of these are determined by particular bishop councils or even the bishop themselves. So the bishop has a lot of autonomy within his diocese to determine what saints we're going to celebrate and what we don't celebrate, right? As a matter of fact, every region has what they call an Ordo, a book that the bishops say, yep, this day we're going to celebrate this type of mass, and go from there.
Will that change as the bishops change?
It could.
It
could.
Not necessarily.
So like sometimes, so a bishop has that say. Now maybe a bishop has a particular personal devotion, right? Like, hey, I really like this Moses the Black guy, so we're going to go and celebrate his celebrate. Now it may not be like a feast, maybe like an optional memorial, because that comes from the universal church, right? But to actually determine what days we celebrate as a memorial or an optional memorial, the bishop's going to have to say on that. So you couldn't elevate, let's say, like, like good example, like we just had St. Patrick, right? You couldn't elevate him on your own, right? So you could elevate him if he's like your titular saint, meaning if we were St. Patrick Parish and we have St. Patrick's Day, that's automatically a solemnity for us, right? It's elevated to the highest form. But you can't do that just like, hey, we at St. Anne really like St. Patrick, so let's go celebrate him as a feast. No, we can't do that, right? A bishop can elevate it. So he can say, look, we have to get explicit permission, right? But a bishop can't necessarily elevate it to a solemnity, right? That has to come from the universal church, okay? So, when it comes to those things, the bishops have a lot of autonomy in that. And so there are days we used to have ferial days, right? And if you look at the order, what it says, any mass on those days. So it's up to the celebrant to make whatever they want to do. So if there were a saint day that maybe the celebrant has a particular devotion to, he can celebrate that saint, right? But he couldn't elevate it any further than this memorial. Okay, so then you have these optional memorials and memorials, right? So optional memorials, of course, are optional. You could or you don't have to, right? Then you have obligatory memorials where you have to, right? Or also be illicit. Consider being an illicit mass, right? So the priest needs to know these things first off, right? Then you have a feast day, right? Those are kind of, more important days in the calendar, like Feast of the Lord, like the Exaltation of the Cross, the Chair of St. Peter, right? These are all feast days in the Universal Church. So you celebrate these feasts everywhere. And then you have solemnities. So solemnities are celebrated as if they were Sundays. So you have the Gloria, you have the Creed, you have a second reading, right? You have a homily. Those are all dictated by the general instruction of the Roman Missal. And then above that, you have holy days of obligation. So every holy day of obligation is a solemnity, but not every solemnity is a holy day of obligation, right? So for instance, today, St. Joseph's Day, solemnity, right? You celebrate that as if we're Sunday, which is why we can lax our Lenten practice, all that kind of stuff. Even if today fell on a Friday, you wouldn't have to eat, you could still eat meat on that Friday if St. Joseph fell on this Friday. Same thing with the Annunciation. If that fell on a Friday, that's a solemnity. If it fell on a Friday, you were relaxed of your Lenten practice. You could have meat that day, and if you gave something up, you can have it, right? Because it's Sunday, right? Holy days of obligation, though, are also determined by the bishops to elevate it, to make it obligatory for everyone to attend Mass, right? So even though St. Joseph's Day is a solemnity, it's not a holy day of obligation, meaning if you didn't show up to Mass today, you're not committing a mortal sin, right? But if a bishop decides to elevate it to a holy day of obligation, it then becomes obligatory.
So he can do that.
He can do that.
Could he make Ash Wednesday a holy day?
No, because that's a matter of universal law.
Okay.
Right. So
I
actually,
know a lot of people go then.
they do.
I mean, you look at the days that people attend, and that's one of the
And here's the thing: Ash Wednesday is considered a holy day. It's kind of what they call a lacuna, meaning it's like a question in the law, because it is not obligatory. It's not even considered to be like a feast day or memorial for that matter, but it is elevated in some ways because we have like a second reading, although you don't have to do that either, right? It's a little different, the fact we don't have a penitential rite because the ashes take the place of that, right? So it's odd, but it's not mandatory, right? And the way we do it makes it seems like it's like elevated, but it's not, right? Yeah, it's weird. It's kind of weird. But technically a bishop can't make you go to Ash Wednesday Mass.
Or Good Friday.
Right. Right. Now the Pope, if he says, you know what, as a matter of universal law, we're going to make Ash Wednesday, Holy Thursday, and Good Friday obligatory. Okay. I think the argument you can make against that, though, when it comes especially Good Friday, is we can't have a Mass on Good Friday. So how are you going to make that obligatory? Yeah. Right? So yeah, those are interesting points, right? So those are the hierarchies of the Novus Ordo and the hierarchies in the extraordinary form. And they do tend to coincide for the most part, but like say, they're two kind of separate animals in that respect. So like you don't have a solemnity or a feast day in the extraordinary form. You have a low Mass, a high Mass, and a Missa Cantata. That's kind of how the way they do that.
So this morning, then, if I'm listening to you correctly, what we had was a high Mass. No.
Sure. I mean, that's the problem. It's not like really a 1-to-1 ratio, right? So if I were at the oratory today, right, even though it is the Feast of St. Joseph at the oratory too, I could celebrate as if it were low Mass, right? Because the Mass is the Mass.
Well,
now, maybe if I had the forethought and thought, maybe I should get a choir together and practice some hymns with them, maybe I'll do Missa Cantata, right?
Well, this morning, and I think you know him, Bishop Herman's brother, his wife come to Mass.
Yes.
And he said to me, he said, Father's kind of old school. I said, well, a little bit. He said, well, this was a high Mass, wasn't it? And I said, well, I kind of think so, but.
Well, because, yeah, I mean, I used incense, right?
Right.
And so there's a concept, especially in the Novus Ordo, that we call progressive solemnity, right? Now, here's the thing. When it comes to those things, that's already kind of prescribed in the Mass, right? So, like, for a feast day, it's prescribed to the Gloria, right? That automatically kind of elevates it to something different than like a ferial day or a memorial. And the solemnity is required to have a second reading, Gloria, and the Creed. Because, again, that is the solemnity. That's kind of what's prescribed by law, right? So it's already kind of baked into the cake, so to speak, when it comes to these things being feast solemnities. Now, you can make it like the way there can also be a personal way you make it a progressive solemnity, right? For instance, so you notice I chanted the collect and the prayers over the gifts. Now, I didn't chant the preface, though. Well, maybe for Easter, I'm going to chant, because there's a difference in kind between Easter and today, right? So even though if you look at if you look at the missal, if you look at like the general instruction for a missal, it looks at it as the same. They're both solemnities. They both require the creed. They both require the Gloria. They both require these second readings. But Easter is somewhat of a higher caliber, we would say, right? And so maybe as a celebrant, I can maybe present that in a way to kind of focus on that elevation. That maybe I chant a little bit more. Maybe I use a little bit more incense, right? And so that's when we talk about progressive solemnity, that's kind of what we're talking about.
Now, Easter, you've also, and I don't think we've used it at all the Easter masses I've been at, but you have the sequence thrown in there
Yes.
in between there.
Okay,
sometimes sung, sometimes spoken.
Now that's interesting. You said that, Dan. You said so. Wait, you mean sometimes it's said or sometimes spoken, but it's always been done, right?
Well, sometimes it's sung and sometimes it's spoken.
Because here's so again, that's another example of progressive solemnity. Because here's the thing in Easter, and maybe now to be fair, it's hard to remember that sometimes because sequences aren't done very often.
No.
They're only actually done 3 times in the year in the Novus Ordo. Easter Sunday, but an Easter Sunday is prescribed. It's required to be done. It's done on Corpus Christi, but it's optional in Corpus Christi.
Okay, maybe that's where I'm getting some
Yeah,
left
yeah.
out, but
And the other time it's actually an option would be during Our Lady of Sorrows.
okay.
But again, it's optional, right? Easter though is prescribed. Now, to be fair, it's possible that maybe a priest forgot about that because again, it's like we don't do that very often in the Novus Ordo. You do kind of more in the extraordinary form, right? But in the Novus Ordo, it's sort of like, well, yeah, it's one day a year. I would imagine that if a priest skipped it or didn't remember, it was probably unintentional. But it is prescribed for Easter Sunday.
But it doesn't matter whether it's spoken or sung.
No. I mean, it's meant to be sung, but spoken would just be fine too. So that's an example, sort of like an elevated solemnity, but like maybe like at Christmas, right? Because Christmas there's no sequence. Is that the same as the Solemnity of St. Joseph? Well, again, how can I maybe present that in a way that kind of elevates that? And that's up to the celebrant to decide those things, right? When it comes to like things like incense, because here's the thing: the only time you're required to use incense is at funerals, at the commendations, and on Easter Vigil. It is prescribed on Easter Vigil you have to use incense. To more, if anything, just to bless the Easter candle and the book before you sing the Exsultat. So, but any other time, it's not really required, right? But incense does help with that elevation of solemnity, and so people can kind of have a deeper appreciation of what's going on, right? The celebrant has to make those pastoral decisions, and it's a lot of that is up to the celebrant to make those determinations. Because I think sometimes when it comes to incense, especially, you get a lot of people like, well, it's just it's okay. I mean, you can make an argument. I can understand that. I mean, so you have certain people who may have asthma and have problems with that. Well, yeah, okay. We can talk about those things.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
I've got asthma, but it always makes me feel like I'm at home. Like when you go home, your home smells like a certain way. Incense always it just like brings me back to my childhood in church and safety.
Yeah.
It just feels so good.
Well, I mean, they've done things with like different blends now that actually make it more hyperallergenic.
It doesn't.
Yeah,
I got asthma. It doesn't affect me at all.
Well, I mean, so here's an example. I had an example, and this is, oftentimes too, you kind of wonder if it actually is a medical issue, is like kind of hypochondria. And because like, okay, so when I first got ordained, I was at my parish, and I got a call from this person asking if I was going to use incense at the Christmas vigil. No, I mean, again, you don't have to. But I was like, well, yeah, I was kind of planning to use bless the creche, and so it's a pretty high solemnity, so it's good to maybe focus on this. It's a holy day of obligation. And I said, well, yeah, I was like, is there a problem? Well, this person said that their child has a reaction to incense. And so I'm thinking like, oh, like physical reaction. Like, oh, okay, maybe it gets a rat. I don't know. So I was like, well, is there a way we can maybe, you guys can maybe sit in the cry room? Because that has a separate, filtering system. It has, separate air conditioner. So maybe heating. So maybe that could help with not get, no, it doesn't matter. I'm like, oh, this is, my child can't be in the building 24 hours after use of the incense. So I was like, all right, well, let me talk to the pastor and see what we can do. Because I mean, I would like to, but also understand the circumstance. If there's a medical problem, that I don't want to put anyone any excess burden. But let me talk to the pastor. Well, the pastor informed me this person was a doctor, and that the symptoms that this child experiences weren't physical; they were more behavioral. And so I was like, "That's what?" So I was trying to figure out, like, I don't understand what that means. And it's like, well, apparently, according to them, that whenever incense is used, the child becomes unruly afterwards or something. I'm like, oh, okay. Now, the fact this person was a medical doctor, and is there any other factor maybe going on that maybe cause these things? I don't know. And plus, also like what came to mind was like, what do they do for Easter? Because Easter Vigil, you have to use it, and that will be even 24 hours afterwards. Well, that will be like still 8, 9 o'clock, and even if you go to mass late in the day, you're still going to have that 24-hour thing, right? And also funerals. Like, what I noticed was we had like funerals, and the next day this person's child was in the church, and it's like, did anything happen? No. Okay, then.
Did they know that there was incense used?
I think that's the point, Dan. It's like, well, they would have known any better, and it seems like there was something else going on there, right? So I use incense for the Christmas because, like, well, and the person was like, well, we'll find other accommodations if you do. Okay, fine, great. So I did my due diligence. I tried to do what I could, but people are going to be people. I think a great story about that too is one of the former associates at Presentation, who will remain nameless, became a pastor at another parish. And apparently they were going to have incense to this mass, and the server wasn't able to light the coal. It was getting time to start mass, so they decided to just go out, and we'll just fake it. Right? Well, as they were bringing the thermal out, people started. So they go to the sanctuary and said, go get to the gospel. And said, well, the coal's not. So this person called them out in the homily. You're all a bunch of liars. There was no coal lit in that thermal. You all coughing, hacking.
That's awesome.
Oh, God.
The brains are powerful.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I can understand. Like, I know growing up, the incense we used, maybe because our pastor was a little bit frugal, it wasn't good. I mean, it was basically sawdust. I mean, so it wasn't really like it's as a matter of fact, I recall that it kind of reminded me of you saw like sawdust and like vomit down in the cafeteria.
Yeah.
It kind of reminded me of that smell. I was like, oh, and because there's some cheap stuff out there that it does the job, but also it's not the best. The stuff we have here, I think we have some pretty good stuff. It's okay.
Like it.
Yeah. I mean,
I've never been a huge fan of incense, but it's never really bothered me.
Yeah. Right.
But we have someone that would swear at Presentation 6 months after the fish fry, they can still smell fresh in the church.
Yeah. Well, it does take a while to go away, but
It
6
does.
months is stretching it.
Well, I mean, we apparently have a child in the school that can't come to the Station of the Cross because the fish fry just makes it just makes them sick. They can smell the fish
Up
fry
in the church.
Yeah,
Wow.
and you can. I mean, you can. You even have the parish, because the parish center, the cafeterias, right? I mean, you smell the lunch that's going on in there all the time. So I mean, I get it. I guess they just have this aversion of fish, and it causes this reaction. And it's like, okay, it's not like it's obligatory, so fine. So they just stay over at school. Okay, happens.
I sometimes wish I had an aversion to food.
Yeah, my waistline would be a lot. Smaller.
God.
Does that answer the question though, Dan? Did I get kind of hit all the points?
Yeah,
Okay,
I think that covered pretty much all the bases. It's something that's not really explained a whole lot. It's there, and you can see, and some of it's self-explanatory.
Yeah.
But other stuff, and especially with the difference between the Novus Ordo,
Right.
it's that was a change. But for a lot of people, unless you're of a certain age, you really are used to what's going on now and not what used to happen.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's funny. Like I was talking to my dad is early 70s, and he got trained in the extraordinary form, and this would have been like early 60s, and like a year later, they switched over to English, and he had to learn Latin, but then they stopped using Latin and started transitioning things, and it just kind of like, oh, you know. So yeah, I think the people that have actually grown up with the extraordinary form are becoming less and less now. But I think there's also the thing about the extraordinary form, and I don't know what to make of this. I mean, in some ways, I think it's hopeful, but also it's sort of like, where's it leading? If you would go to like Francis de Sales or the Oratory on a Sunday, all you see there are young families, large young families, that are like, you know, in their 20s, 30s, right? So, and someone who hasn't experienced, who never experienced extraordinary form until I got to the seminary, I kind of see the appeal. Because with the extraordinary form, for anyone who hasn't been to one, there's this mystery surrounding it. You know, it's a different language that's not spoken anywhere in the world anymore. There's a lot of actions that are different than you would witness in the Novus Ordo. There's subtle differences that, you know, sort of you pick up on. It's like, I wonder why they do that. And I think there's a great amount of mystery and solemnity involved with it that is kind of different than you may experience in the Novus Ordo. Now, that's not to say you know, I don't want to say I'm promoting one over the other, because that's not what I'm trying to do. I think you can celebrate a very solemn Novus Ordo and beautifully, and be appealing, maybe even more so, right, than the extraordinary form. But there's something about that, I think, the extraordinary form that's appealing, especially young people who haven't experienced it. Maybe it's novel, maybe it's, you know, but it's different than anything else you experience anywhere else.
And I think it is good that you experience it, but having been through both,
yeah,
I think the Novus Ordo is better from the standpoint that you can be part of it, you can understand more of what's going on. It's more open.
Yeah.
You don't have the mystery, but sometimes part of that mystery is good. But if you understand it,
right,
then you can understand why the traditions were the way they were.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
It explains a lot of the things.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that, and that's I think what it comes down to. I think this was the wisdom of Pope Benedict in allowing both forms. Like, look, it's a matter of preference. If you feel more at home in the Novus Ordo, go there. If you feel more at home in the extraordinary form, go there. Which is why there's such a reaction when Pope Francis decided to kind of, you know, limit the extraordinary form, because it was sort of like, well, what is the purpose here? And, you know, even though he did give his reasonings behind that, you know, I think you can make arguments either way. I mean, and you could also even ask about, well, is that really true? I mean, so the reason he kind of gave for his limitation was that there's a vein, I guess, of the people that go to the extraordinary form that really are not upholding what Benedict XVI was holding, was that they're both valid forms. No one's better than the other. It's a matter of personal preference. To take more of the sedevacantist argument, which was the only valid form of the Mass is the extraordinary form. So a lot of people, like in SSPX, Society of St. Pius X, who kind of fell away after Vatican II because of this split when it came to the liturgy, and maybe other sedevacantists. So when I say sedevacantists, you know what I mean by that? That's a Latin term, means the seat is empty. So what they're basically saying is that there's no current pope, right? So like SSPX, they would say the last valid pope was St. Pius X. Okay. So again, we have this.
Thank you for clearing that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no problem.
Does the term holier than thou come to mind?
Well, again, I mean, you sure, right? I mean, it's one of these things where it's like you kind of roll your eyes in some ways, like, all right. But I think what they were trying to get at is like there's this tradition that's been upheld for 500 years, and you know, I think there was a fear that it was going to be taken away, right? Now, maybe the Holy Father has a point. I'm sure there's probably some people that attend the extraordinary form who would say, yeah, this is the only way to do it, right? Now, do they mean that's the only valid way to do it, or this is the only way that they really appreciate? I think a lot of this was kind of based on like online chats and comments. And of course, you know, when you go online and see people are going to be trolls regardless.
Right.
So there's a question in that respect of like, well, true is that statement? Is that really more of a broad application, or is it just a small sect of people that maybe think that, in which case their parish priest has a great responsibility to correct them, or the bishop for that matter. I think one of the things that was kind of caused more consternation with it was that the Holy Father didn't really say much about abuses in the Novus Ordo. I mean, I don't think you have to go far, even here in the Archdiocese, to find my brother priests, unfortunately, who make up their own words for the Eucharistic prayer or for the collect or other things. I had a teacher come to me in a former parish and just ask, like, okay, so listen, like, what makes the Mass valid? What has to be said? And I said, well, you have to have some kind of reading, preferably a gospel. And as long as the priest who's validly ordained, assuming he's validly ordained, says, this is my body and this is my blood, it's a valid Mass. Now, they could say anything else other than that, you know, if they want to make up their own words of the anamnesis and the epiclesis, okay, I would not advise that. And I would even go as far as saying that would be valid matter for the confessional for me, if I were to willfully change those. I would say I can't speak for anyone else, but that would be a mortal sin for me to willfully do that, because I know better. But for validity, that's all that's necessary. But you find a lot of priests who are celebrating, in my opinion, illicit masses. And that's very unfortunate, because I do believe those priests will be judged for that someday. Right?
Their congregation is unaware, I guess. Or...
You would hope. I don't know. I mean, it's hard because, like, it's not that these are bad men, and they have other gifts, right? And again, I always kind of fall back on my old adage that we all are products of the seminary we come from. And so I do know there was a time in the seminary where liturgy really was an emphasis, right? It was sort of like, well, read this book and figure it out. Or maybe there were some interesting theologians that were brought into the discussion that maybe weren't necessarily in line with the church was to say about liturgy. And maybe there were more theorists that never really got, but they could be open questions. And that kind of gets in the water sometimes, right? And so that kind of informs you, right? And then I think as a lot of priests, I mean, it's not that we necessarily want to do things wrong. It's just that maybe you just don't have the time to go read these documents to figure out what we're doing is right, right? I think a lot of priests fall into that. I mean, I have to tell you, was like Fratelli Tutti came out, and I still haven't read it. I mean, just because I haven't had time to sit down and just read through it and kind of, I mean, I'm sure it's a great document. There's a lot in it, but I mean, and I don't even know really what it, I mean, I know it's about fraternal charity, but also, okay, I don't know if do I need to learn anything more about fraternal charity? I don't know, maybe I so I don't want to judge, and I definitely don't want to judge harshly my brother priests that maybe tend to do these things, because I just don't know where they're at. Maybe like I said, for me it could be moral sin. I don't know what it is for them. I can't judge them. I don't know their soul. I don't know their mind. So I don't know. But it is kind of heartbreaking, because I find great value in the liturgy, and I appreciate when it's celebrated reverently and beautifully. And people may differ with me on their kind of opinion as far as like use of certain things. Like, you kind of mentioned, Dan, like when it comes to Novus Ordo, people can appreciate like understand what's going on. I agree. I think what's kind of fascinating though is that the documents of Vatican II uphold that, but I imagine a lot of the understanding comes from the fact that we're using the vernacular. Where if you read the documents of Vatican II, the intention is pretty clear that the vernacular shall be used until people understand what's going on, and then return back to Latin. But we've gotten to this kind of catch-22 when it comes to these things that, well, once Vatican II came out and these documents came out, even before these documents came, we stopped teaching Latin because, well, we're going to be using the vernacular.
So how can you go back to it if you haven't taught
right,
that?
Right. And so now I think a lot of places now are starting to teach it again, which is great. Because I know when I was going to high school, I don't think there may have been 2 high schools that taught Latin, and CUC did not offer it. I think they may now, but I was kind of, when I started learning Latin, I was kind of dismayed because I think it helps you understand not only English better, but other languages. But also too, understanding the Mass in a deeper way. Who was it? St. Jerome said that love of Latin is love of the church, right? And so I think there's a truth there because, words that we use in Latin don't translate perfectly into English or Greek into Latin for that matter, right? And so there is an adage that translation does betray meaning. And so when we start hearing things in English and have an understanding, like I've always used this example before, but John 21, when Jesus tells Peter, "Do you love me?" Right? Well, in English, we have the word for love, right? And love can mean love of ice cream or love for your mother, right? It's the same word, but the context is a little different, right? Well, the Greeks and the Latins actually had words that were more in line with the context. So in that line, when Jesus says to Peter, "Do you love me?" what he's saying is, Peter, agape, Sue. Will you love me as I love you to sacrifice for me? And you would think Peter would be strong. Oh, agapo, yeah. But he doesn't. He responds, philo. Well, I'll love you as a brother or friend. Okay, Peter, agape, philo. And the third time, Jesus actually condescends. Okay, fine, Peter, philo, right? But you're going to give me agape eventually. So maybe you're not there yet. Now, that's a great lesson for us to understand, to meet people where they're at. But if I never studied Greek, I would never know that, right? So these things are important when it comes to the context of not only Scripture, but also the liturgy. Because we can't necessarily have a full understanding if we're just going from one particular language,
Which sometimes gets changed over
the
decades.
Right.
A different translation comes along.
Well, it's fascinating because, like, you don't really think about this when you're growing up, but like, I had this conversation with the kids over there, and like, I'll say something in Latin, and they're like, "What is that? Is that Spanish?" I'm like, "Well, no." Is it like a form of English? Like, actually, this is a language that actually predates our language. English wasn't around back at the time of the Romans, right? So that kind of blows their minds because you think like English has been around forever. Well, actually, no. It came out of these Germanic and Roman languages that helped form it, right? Same thing with Spanish and Italian and French, right? And Spanish, So it's kind of interesting to think about that. Right? So yeah, I don't know. I mean, like I said, but I think the point you're making there and is interesting. Like, I think before we actually start moving maybe back to Latin, we have to start teaching it, right? And the question is, when is that going to start happening on a regular basis? I don't know.
Because there's fewer of us left that participated in the full Latin Mass.
Right.
I can remember. Well, I served them. I can remember. But one of the changes that I really liked when they made the change, the priest facing the congregation.
So here's the interesting thing about that. Nowhere in the documents of Vatican II does it state that the altar should be removed from the tabernacle, and the proper position for the priest is what they call pro populum, towards the people.
Well, where did they get the idea that it's...
Yeah. So I think before Vatican II, there was a lot of innovation being done. And so there was kind of formulated things that were kind of being tried and done and figured out. And so I think in the same way as kind of this was a development in a way, and you could say a natural way too, maybe. There was more appreciation in that respect. And it just never got corrected. So as there was this change of the priest facing, the people started constructing churches or physically moving the altar away from the tabernacle, like it happened here at St. Anne, and the priest started facing the people, there's this thing in canon law called moss. So what moss states is that if a particular practice being done in a local church, meaning parish, diocese, with the knowledge of the local ordinary, meaning the bishop, right, for a span of 35 years, it becomes canon law for that particular church. Now, if you have multiple churches doing that for a certain amount of time, well, that becomes canon law. And canon law would say it's more of an allowance than it is a dictate. But it's also could become a norm, right? And that's kind of what happened when these things was that the priests started doing pro populum, moving the altar without any real authority, so to speak, from Rome.
But they weren't said don't.
But no one said don't do it. And the bishops actually had positive knowledge of it. Yeah. And so it was like, okay.
Well, did face-to-face, the option of face-to-face confession start then too, or was that introduced later?
I think they did, yeah, because if you look at like a lot of the churches that were built, well, especially in the Middle Age, but even through like, you know, the Renaissance, they didn't have the option of like going face-to-face, right? Even, I mean, a good example of that even is the cathedrals. The new and the old cathedrals down, you know, they don't have an option right now even to go to face-to-face, right? Your only option is go anonymously. Because that predates Vatican II. But the Vatican II did make in canon law, and per canon law, you have the right to go either anonymously or face-to-face, right? So what it basically says is if it can be done, you should allow for that. But the question is what does that mean can be done? Well, my confessional is only configured for this way. Okay.
But can't the confessional be changed?
Well, so the question there, Dan, would be, okay, well, how much money would that take? How much? I mean, so like, let's say you have a piece of art that may be part of that wall.
Yeah, the cathedral's a little bit different.
Right. Yeah, right. Well, that's what I'm saying.
Presentation that had to be changed,
right,
to accommodate
right.
that.
Well, and there's other factors there too. Like for instance, one of the other changes they had made was actually after 2002, was you had to actually have windows into the confessional, right? Because you want to make sure you know what's going on in there, right? So we have that here at St. Anne. The window goes out to the outside, and it's stained glass, but that does technically meet the requirement, right? Some people actually had to put them in their doors. So yeah, it's those are things that kind of are changing, but for pastoral need, kind of, right?
Is one of the changes that I've noticed more so over the last couple of years on the altar. Now most of the churches have a smaller cross that faces the priest. Is that so that he's facing the cross when he's facing the people?
Correct. Yeah, because like I said, if you're doing ad orientem, everyone's facing the cross, right?
Right.
Well, why shouldn't the priest be able to face a cross?
Yeah.
if they're actually
part
offering
of this job,
yeah,
you would think that would be
so
necessary.
that's to that point though too. Like that's not necessarily explicitly required, right? But it is something that would be a good practice.
Yeah, up until a couple of years ago, I hadn't really noticed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so.
Yeah. I mean, I do it because but we haven't actually. It's funny, we haven't put one out there at presentation yet. No. I was thinking about that the other day. I was like, why is there a cross here?
Didn't Father Dolan have one that laid on the?
There's one back in the back. I just haven't gotten around to put it out there.
No, I thought he had one laid on the.
Yeah, that's fine too. You know, again, it's sort of like this understanding of like, you know, it conforms in a deep way what's actually happening, right? That hey, I'm bringing about this moment in time to the people and myself. Should I have some representation of that visibly?
Well, and that brings to mind then at Our Lady of the Pillar, behind the altar, they don't have a cross back there. There's a cross that's more, here's the altar, here's the people, and it's like over here.
Yeah, I mean, so the question though, is it visible?
It's visible.
Yeah.
You kind of have to look for it.
Yeah.
Though.
So I know in my home parish in Macklehart Mary in South City, they used to have a crucifix that hung down over the altar from the ceiling.
Okay, over the altar itself.
Right.
Okay.
And so but they had to move it because the weight of no one did this calculation. The weight of the cross was causing some problems on the roof, and so they put it over the side. But people can still see it from all the angles, so it's like, okay, that's probably good. So yeah, I mean, again, you kind of do the best you can with the space you got. And maybe there could be some other practical reason why it's not directly behind. I don't know.
Well, I don't.
But you think Our Lady of the Pillar probably can afford to do whatever they need to do in some ways too. I don't know.
We attended a number of masses there when we were church shopping.
Oh, okay.
I mean, one of the previous times when we were church shopping.
Sure. Yeah.
Because we've been through it, but and they had some mass times that were agreeable to us because we like to go early.
Yeah.
And they had a 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning. No singing at all. No offense, but I don't mind not singing.
I'm used to that too. In the early
That's
masses,
true.
right?
And not that it was a benefit, but
Right.
because there was no singing, even though there were quite a few people that attended, it was only about a 35-minute mass.
Yeah.
They had all the other parts that involved with
Oh
it.
yeah.
But and it just seemed odd not to have the cross behind the crucifix behind there.
Yeah. Like I said, I mean, it could be maybe this issue with the wall. I mean, you don't really. I mean, you never know. I don't know.
But having looked at their bulletin, they've got some of the same issues as far as finances and the way they talk about things. You would expect where they're located, it wouldn't be an issue.
Right.
And if push came to shove, it probably isn't. But
well, the other thing to keep in mind as well, when it comes to Our Lady of the Pillar, they're run by an order. And so the order also has some financial responsibility. They're Marianists.
Yeah, Marianists, yeah.
So they have the order also has some responsibility for that too. So it's sort of the faithful may be contributing, but also the order has responsibility there to do those things too. Whereas as an archdiocesan priest, I'm kind of on my own here. I got to do what we do things at the behest and at the good graces of the people of the parish, right? Whereas an order, if I were a Jesuit, hey, you guys got to help me here. Where are you guys at?
But you mentioning the Jesuits,
I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
No, that's fine because my wife asked me a question about Jesuits.
Oh yeah.
Well, there was.
I'm not an expert, trust me, but I'll tell you.
Well, she's heard of various people, priests mostly, making jokes about Jesuits, and she asked about that situation.
Before we go any further, Dan, I just want to say all the jokes I've heard about Jesuits have come from Jesuits.
Of course.
Yeah, so just FYI, right.
Well, that's the way most of the inappropriate jokes are told. If there's a joke about Polish people, it's typically told by Polish people,
right,
or Irish jokes, or pick a nationality or any kind of group.
Right.
But she was asking me if there was a book that kind of explained that, and I said, well, Jesuits are known to be, first of all, very outspoken, kind of doing what they are going to do, and the consequences be damned. But beyond that, a better explanation I didn't have, and I didn't know if there was any books that really
like the history of the Jesuits, that kind of thing.
But that'll explain how the Jesuits were formed, and but that doesn't say how are the Jesuits different from some of the other.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so again, I'm not an expert, but the Jesuits have this history going back to St. Ignatius, right? So St. Ignatius actually was a very kind of practical guy, and if he would be considered to be a spiritual master. And if you read the stuff that he put out there, it's actually very logical. Like he's actually very cerebral, very kind of like practical in the way he approaches spiritual life. I actually kind of appreciate it. I mean, as much as I make fun of the Jesuits, I love Ignatius Loyola. I think he's a brilliant guy, and he has a lot of good stuff there, right? That I use in my own spiritual life. I think what occurred is these Jesuits are highly trained, highly educated, even at the time of Ignatius, because. Yeah, so a lot of these universities are run by Jesuits, and again, you want to lump everyone in together, but these happen to be the leaders of these schools who are the ones that subscribe to this conference, and there were even bishops present. So you have the hierarchy of the church there too. It's sort of like, great, whatever. So in the same way, like when things like Fiducia Supplicans come out, or like even Custodius Fidei, the document came out about the limitation of the Latin Mass. I've pledged obedience to the church and to our hierarchy. And so if a document comes out that's by the Holy Father, and it's actually an ex-cathedra document, meaning it's coming from him as the Pope, I take it into consideration, right? I have to. The only time I don't have to is if it actually is in direct conflict with the teaching of the church. And no Pope has ever done that. So good, right? So that's, I think, why a lot of Jesuits get kind of beat up, so to speak. And again, I know a lot of really, really good Jesuits. So I'm not saying, I mean, there's a lot of them I really love.
And they probably tell a lot of really
They do.
Jesuit
They do.
jokes.
So some of the best jokes I've heard about Jesuits came from them. And so, but I think also there's this understanding within themselves, like, yeah, that was, what can you do? Once you sign on to these things, once you become a Jesuit, it's like you were dedicated to the order, right?
Well, it's ironic because the Pope is a Jesuit.
Yeah.
No, he's not.
I thought he was.
He was.
Now, when did
You
that-
can't be the Pope and be a Jesuit.
Well, he was a Jesuit until he was elected.
Correct. He was a Jesuit until he was elected bishop. He made a bishop. That's true. Yeah. Because one thing Jesuits pledge, they pledge never take higher orders. That's one of the promises they make.
Huh.
So he had to be dispensed from the order to become a bishop.
But they can be a bishop or an archbishop, no? Okay, so before he was elected Pope, he was
the Archbishop of Argentina.
so
And
he had to
he was no longer, yeah, so before he became the Archbishop of Argentina,
Yeah.
Buenos Aires,
Yeah.
he had to be dispensed from his orders as a Jesuit. Yeah. Now that's different in other orders. Like,
but,
so for
but
instance,
the other orders were glad to pick him up after they got rid of him.
well, he became an archdiocesan priest at that point.
Yes.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, other orders do it differently. Like, so, for instance, Franciscans, yeah, you can hold higher office. It's fine if you want. Actually, it was kind of ironic because St. Francis of Assisi didn't want to be ordained a priest. He was forced to be ordained a deacon so he actually maintained an order. The same thing happened with St. John Baptist of Sal. He didn't want to become a priest either, but he had to become a priest to actually maintain an order. So it's kind of ironic you have these orders that make these bishops and stuff, and it's like, well, your founder didn't really want that.
Yeah. Didn't even want the job.
Right, yeah.
Well, it's interesting when you're with a priest
Mm-hmm.
in a meeting, public meeting, and there's a priest that lives not too far from here who told me one time, and other people were in this. He's of the belief that Pope Francis, there's very few things that are a sin in Pope Francis's eye. Of course, he strongly disagrees with that,
I don't know. I mean, I know that sometimes we get wrapped around the comments that he makes, and like the last one that came up, it was said what he said. I hope nobody's in hell. That went through the whole cycle, and it's like, well, yeah, we should hope nobody's in hell. That doesn't mean there aren't anybody in hell.
Right.
It's just we should hope that, right? I mean, that's actually
That's why we
true.
pray.
Right, exactly, right,
Those
yeah,
of their souls,
right.
absolutely.
I mean, so I think sometimes people get so focused on these little sound bites, or even the fact that he said anything, and it's just like, well, what he said wasn't wrong,
No,
but I think
you focus on 10% of the soundbite and disregard the other 90%, like the comments on blessing the same-sex couples.
right. Well, I mean, and that's the thing when it comes to fiducia supplicans. I mean, I've said this before, and I keep on saying it. It's so interesting how many people come talking about it. And my first question is, have you read the document? And about nine and a half times out of 10, they don't. Right, and I get it. Again, I understand. It's like, yeah, it's time to read it. I get it. I actually read it though, and the thing about it is, I think the thing so interesting about it is that everything he said in it, I would have even done before the document came out, right? So it's like, okay, I mean, this doesn't change anything for me. So what's the big deal? And I think most priests probably would say the same thing, like, oh yeah, because I use this example, and actually I used to talk to my dad about this because I think he was getting kind of wrapped around the axle. I was like, Dad, if two men came to me that were in a same-sex union, and they say, no, Father, we understand what the church teaches, and we're trying to maintain our chastity. We're living in separate beds, even separate rooms in our house. We're in this union because so we can share benefits, and so I go visit him in the hospital, he can visit me, right? That's the reason why we did it. We're trying to maintain chastity. We're trying to do the best we can. Can we have a blessing to help us with that? Yes, yes, 100,000 times yes, right? Great. And I can even bless them together, right? Good, fine, whatever. That's much different than, Father, I want you to recognize our bond and bless us in our bond. Let's have a discussion, right?
Yeah.
Let's have a talk
Yeah.
about what marriage is and what that means, right? I think a very wise priest always once told me, you never say no. You can say, though, not yet, right? Now, that not yet may never come, but you don't tell someone straight up no, right? I think that's wise. Because when it comes to things like marriage and this thing that we have as a sacrament, as a even a natural bond, we would respect and say that's of God. It's important to understand what that is, and many people don't. I would say even most people don't. I know I didn't. I think when the whole same-sex union came up, I was still working. And I think my thought on it was like, man, it didn't really affect me at all. I didn't really care. I was like, what's the big deal? Whatever, who cares? I think most people have that attitude. That doesn't really affect me. Why do I care? If they want to go and do whatever they want to do, what's it to me? Well, I think I've learned that's not really being my brother's keeper, first. And secondly, it does a lot of harm to what the sacrament of marriage is directed to. Right? And even the Holy Father said that it seems that unions. I mean, there's nothing necessarily wrong with unions as long as you're trying to live as if you were chaste, right? And that's the same for anybody. We're all called to chastity, whether we're married or not, right? It's just that chastity takes a different form in marriage than it does outside of marriage. So okay, yeah. I don't know. It's a tough discussion because I think it's so much ingrained in the culture now that you can make whatever you want.
Well, some of these people, we get hung up on the word bless. I can bless you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I bet you if you ask a lot of Catholics if they could do a blessing, they would tell you no.
Right. Yeah, and that was actually funny. We talked about this RSA, didn't we? Like this past weekend, we talked about blessings and what that means, and the blessing is as good as the authority of the person blessing, right? And sometimes it's very profound. So, like, let's say if you're blessing your son or daughter, well, that might have more of an impact than if I bless your son or daughter, because of the relationship you have with that person, right? Even though I'm doing it with the authority of the church, you're doing it with the authority as their father or mother, right? That may be much deeper authority, right? Because of the responsibility you have. Blessings, I think we lose track of what blessings are. Blessings are not magical talismans that kind of put a spell on people or, make things into magic, Blessings are meant for someone to receive the grace of the sacraments in a deeper way. So if I bless a house, what I'm blessing are the people in that house. They receive the great graces of the sacrament of marriage and the Eucharist and confession and their baptisms and their confirmations in a deeper way to be enlivening for them and flourishing for them, right? Same way I bless anything.
Well, the same people that say that they can't give blessings, how many of them are going to take holy water and chalk home on Epiphany and bless their houses
Right.
and go throughout and sprinkle holy water in each of the rooms?
That's right.
They're giving a blessing then. So
it's very funny. The Book of Blessings has distinctions between clergy and laymen blessing. So what that indicates is that laymen can bless, right? Not in the same way as a clergy, but they can. And maybe it's more efficacious for them. They do. Again, the point of the blessing is that people receive the grace of the sacraments in a deeper way. That's the point.
Last week you were talking about family members and stuff that religious
Mhm.
and everything. And not even family members, just anybody, especially young people nowadays. They say, well, I have faith, I pray, I talk to God, and but things just keep happening to me. Is he not listening to me, or why is he making things happen? Or they say, I know a very religious person that prays all the time and has the faith, but then seems like bad things happen to him. And just in the world, what's going on, people ask, why is God letting this happen?
Yeah.
Seems like I can just go to Amazon and ask, and I get it.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't work.
Well, yeah.
God.
But you want them to try and, be, I don't know if it's religious or Catholic, or you try and evangelize them or try and help them, and they're saying, well, I'm trying, but things are still happening.
Yeah, I think in the spiritual here, I think there's two things that kind of recognize. Again, we're talking about an omniscient being that is beyond our understanding and our reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also important to understand that God never promised that if we would pray all the time and even receive the sacraments or grow in our life of spirituality, that we're going to receive pleasure and happiness and joy all the time. As a matter of fact, I think He promised us the opposite.
Yeah.
Right? That if we're truly doing it right,
the world will hate us.
Right, exactly. We're gonna experience persecution and evil and other things. But we should take heart, because that actually means we're conforming closer to Jesus. Right? So the question about allowing these things to happen, these evils to happen, I mean, that's always an ancient question that really has no good answer from a human standpoint. Because, God does allow evil to happen, even to good people. And in the circumstances and the situation people find themselves in, it's easy to say, well, this is happening for a reason. And that's true, but that's not usually helpful, right?
But more so too, they say, I want to get close to God and everything, but.
Well, I would look at this. So I look at this way in the spiritual life, and all the spiritual masters kind of talk about this, that whenever you're trying to do the right thing, get closer to God, that's when you're going to experience the most spiritual warfare. Right? Meaning Satan is also very cunning and wise. And he exists. That's first of all. We have that be given. He does exist, and he does not want you to do that. And he's going to do everything he can to keep you from doing that.
Yeah.
Right? And so when we experience these roadblocks, these sufferings, these persecutions, that's actually an affirmation that we're on the right path. Right? That if this really weren't difficult, well, then that means the devil's not working against me, which means he wants this to happen, which means I should maybe change course. But yeah, I mean, I think that's always kind of a question when it comes to like why these things happen. Well, I don't know. I mean, we may never know that until we're actually with him in heaven. I do trust it happens for a reason. I don't know what that reason is all the time. Sometimes we experience these things so we can actually conform deeper to Jesus, deeper with our God. That doesn't make it easy, but for me, that's a good enough reason. Yeah, I think the other thing too that people tend to realize, the other way of looking at this too is, well, yeah, I pray all the time, and I watch all these evangelists on TV, and I read the Bible every day. Cool. Do you have your children baptized? Have you gone to Mass anytime soon? Have you gone to confession? Because those are all good. Again, these things are all good, but also there's a grace that we are missing out on by not doing these things. And maybe that's actually God telling you, you got to do something different, right?
You have to learn to listen. And I'm no expert.
You're not alone. None of us are, right?
Last night, I said to my wife, when we were watching the news, unfortunately, they showed the picture of that mother of that 2-year-old baby that died for that drug overdose. And I said, why, to my wife, why does God allow people like that? They have children, and we've got people in this world that would love to have a child and aren't blessed. That's a question. I mean, I've got a long list for them.
Yeah, no, and these are all great questions. I mean, because like I said, I've counseled many.
I'm not judging her, but
No, I've counseled many people that have suffered from infertility, and you know, it's a struggle because, like, you know, there are easy solutions. You know, if you want to go pay $40,000 and get IVF, there's an option.
It's not an easy
It's not
solution.
right. It's not. Well, I mean, but it's not. But it is. I mean, in the long run, compared to like burying this and not doing it, it is
Yeah.
easier,
Yeah.
right? And I think part of that is kind of a discernment of like, well, maybe you're even called to do something else. Maybe you're called to live your motherhood and your fatherhood in a different way. I do, right? As far as I don't have any children, pretty sure. And so, you know, but I do have thousands of spiritual children, and there's something fulfilling about that. And I still act as a father in those ways. So, I mean, I don't know. It's difficult. That is a good question. I don't know.
yeah,
I think part of that is because, well, God does give us free will,
yes.
Oh yeah.
yes.
and we have choices in how we receive these graces. You know, I think another difficult question, and I don't usually bring this up with couples that are going through this, but you know, a question that often is asked, like, well, have you ever used like contraception or like the pill? Because there have been studies showing that the use of the pill like does affect your fertility. And I know that, I mean, I have 4 sisters, and I know that sometimes they weren't using the pill for, you know, because they were promiscuous or whatever, but they were using it because it was prescribed to them by a dermatologist to help with their acne. And I think that happens with a lot of women, and men maybe for that matter. And so that does have an impact though on the fertility. That can be even more impactful throughout time. It just goes to show that there's a nature to our bodies. There's a rhythm to our bodies. There's a way our bodies work. And once we start tinkering with those things, it causes more problems. Maybe you get couples too that never done it before. And it's just like, yeah, there's something going on. I don't know. And now, I think what's been helpful though, in those circumstances, and a lot of people don't do this either for some reason, but there's been development in natural family planning, and specifically in NAPRO technology, that helps to individualize a woman's body to determine where those issues of infertility may be. And oftentimes it's a simple issue of like a hormone imbalance, right? And it's cheaper than going to IVF or anything else, right? So people just don't know about it. Part of that's just because I think if you Google infertility, what's going to come up is thousands of IVF doctors and maybe one NAPRO technology doctor.
Yeah. Advertising.
Yeah. Right.
Well, I've known couples that just couldn't have children, and they would adopt. And within a year, they were expecting.
Right. That's how it goes. That's how it goes. Yeah.
When it rains, it pours.
That's right.
You know. There's so much we don't know about the human body.
Right. Right.
So much.
Yeah. I mean, it's Paul VI said all in the Humanae Vitae. That's the thing about it. It's like, and then John Paul II also in his Evangelium Vitae. You start reading these documents from the popes, and it's just like, wow, these guys are prophetic. Like, they knew what was going on. I don't know if they had some glimpse of the future, but they did know what these things that they've done in the 60s, 70s, 80s would lead to. And I think we're reaping the benefits of those, or the maliciousness of those things now. You know, it's funny. I'm on the Respect Life Apostolate board, and part of my duty is doing like a monthly formation with the staff down there at the Regalic Center, and we've been working through the theology of the body. So those who don't know, theology of the body are these every Wednesday the Pope has these kind of just they're kind of sermons for the most part, right? And this is, I think it was started before John Paul II, but from like 1979 to like 1984, every Wednesday was dedicated towards this theology of the body. It was focused on Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And in it, he kind of talks about how, you know, man is designed as be a sexual being, and like kind of how that works with the other, how woman and man were originally created, what they were created for, how sexuality worked into that, and then also like what happened after the fall. And so it's basically 4 years every Wednesday of these documents that the Pope did, and we're only through like the first like 15. So we got like about 170 more to go. But it's fascinating, like how John Paul II back in the 70s and 80s predicted what we would see today with like transgenderism and homosexuality and rise of pornography, and it's uncanny. It's uncanny. So yeah, I don't know. Great. Well,
all we can do is pray.
amen.
Mhm.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, unless there are any more questions, I guess we'll call it a night.
It's very interesting.
Great.
Thank you for the topic.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Thank you.